In the previous videos, you saw that Martin Luther, John Calvin and Charles Spurgeon, in keeping with the consensus of the Reformation itself, all did in fact, denounce Christmas. Calvin going so far as to call it satanic, and Spurgeon considering it worse than smoking, selling the gospel, or even collaborating with Lucifer worshippers. And you saw that there had been a continuous, unbroken historical witness against the practice of Christmas since the Reformation, based on many texts and principles from the scriptures, both from Christ and his original apostles. Now in the video, we will return to the text in chapter 11 and show how it was fulfilled in history, in the Protestant Reformation, which was in fact, precisely and unequivocally, what John had been prophesying in that chapter. And not only has it been fulfilled in history, the fact it has been fulfilled, has been intentionally hidden by the very people the chapter is pointing its finger at prophetically, to warn the world against. And as you will see, just as you saw in verse 6, there will be undeniable physical, geological and astronomical signs in the earth. These things have already come to pass, and you are living in the history of the fulfillment of these prophecies. They are not all future at the end of the world in a fictitious 7-year tribulation after a rapture. They are right now, all around you. We stopped our exposition of Revelation 11 at verse 10 to take a 3-video tour of the history of the Protestant Reformation on Christmas. Because the Counter-reformation is busy today rewriting that history in an attempt to give Protestants the completely false impression the Reformation either embraced Christmas or had nothing to say about it, which is completely false retelling of history. But now that we have established the fact, the Reformation really did bring the witness that Chronos should be no more, we are ready to finish the rest of the verses in the first prophecy of the chapter, which John calls the second woe. The first woe occurred in Revelation chapter 9 with the coming of the papacy and the dark ages of inquisition and torture, and the invasion of the Mongolian army from across the Euphrates River. The second woe was the burning of God's witnesses, and God's retribution on the empire for doing that, in the form of ergotism and the Black Death plagues, the mega droughts that afflicted Central Europe, which was the area of the Holy Roman Empire, and the beginning of red tide, or as the scriptures called it, water turned to blood. And as you saw clearly stated in verse 2, these residents are Gentiles, not Jews. Meaning this had to occur in history past. As pointed out previously, the demographics window on this text closed at the end of the 1800s. And so did the possibility of the fulfillment of this prophecy along with it. In fact, as stated earlier, anyone that tries to tell you Revelation chapter 11 is about the future, is simply either not bothering to even read what is in the text, or is simply intentionally lying about it. If you have been watching the series, you have viewed over 10 hours and 46 minutes worth of material in 9 videos on Revelation chapter 11. In fact, the truth is, if you have watched all 9 videos, you are more educated on Revelation chapter 11 than most seminary students are after they have paid hundreds and in some cases thousands of dollars. The reason you know more than they do about Revelation chapter 11 is because in the 10 hours of videos you have watched, you have been shown all the things that are being intentionally hidden from them by their teachers. So you know what they are being told, and you know what they are not being told. You know both sides, and they only know one. You are shown in video 23 that no matter how you interpret the text in verse 2, either using futurism dating or historicist dating, you are left with a past date, which has long ago come and gone. So the futurism interpretation is out for the count as early as verse 2, because there is no gap given by John in his date of 42 months after the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles, which we know to have historically occurred in 130 AD. 42 months in futurism dating leaves you with the year 134 AD. In historicist dating it leaves you with the year 1390. Those are your only 2 options, with the exception of lying. You are also shown in video 23, as mentioned in verse 8, that post-mortem corpse exposure is a practice that is no longer legal not only in Jerusalem, but most of the rest of the world. The window for the fulfillment of that prophecy also closed around the middle to the end of the 1800s. You are shown in video 23 that the idea of literal fire-breathing prophets is a superstitious reliance on magical interpretations of biblical texts from the Dark Ages, and that physically, biologically, and chemically no such thing could happen without killing the very same human who would be doing it. And you were shown in video 23 that no such interpretation is necessary, because John point blank and overtly states in verse 4 that the two witnesses he is speaking of are symbolic, stating they stand in the presence of God in the present tense in 95 AD, and would have to be almost 2,000 years old if they came today. And he says they are the two trees of Zechariah's vision which feed oil into a never-ending temple menorah, and they are the two Sabbath candles lit around the world to mark the day of the Lord. You saw in video 24 how counter-reformationists claim 1/3 of the entire Earth has already been blown off by an asteroid, and then they claim the remainder has gone through a global nuclear holocaust, and yet come to chapter 11 and want to pretend that verse 9 is a prophecy about TV sets, in order to solve the problem of Jews living in Israel, rather than the people of many nations, as it is actually described by the text, and leave themselves with a ridiculous claim that after having 1/3 of the Earth blown off, and the remaining 2/3 burned up in a nuclear holocaust, everyone's TVs are still working just fine, and can still watch the evening news to see what's going on in Jerusalem. A completely ridiculous claim, in that the destruction of 1/3 of the Earth itself would render the entire planet uninhabitable, never mind the global nuclear holocaust on top of it. There is way too much overkill for any of those claims to be simultaneously real or true. They are patently absurd. And you saw in video 24 that counter-reformationists really can't tell you anything accurate about Revelation, because they can't even so much as tell you what an angel is, in the book, mentioned over 53 times in the texts. Instead, they show you a picture of a Greek Nike flying around in the sky, as though that is ever going to happen, since Greek Nikes are mythological creatures with bird wings. Greek Nikes are, however, mentioned as idols animated by the demonic spirits of Mystery Babylon in chapter 18. They are described not as God's angels, but the demonic spirits of an apostate pseudo-Christian religion that spans the world, led by a man of sin mentioned in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, who speaks as God. And you saw in video 25, according to the grammar and language in the text in Revelation 11, the two witnesses retaliate against their enemies by doing to their enemies exactly what their enemies did to them, specifically mentioned being burned to death, which obviously cannot be done by two dead people. And that the beast, a very clear reference to the head of the Roman Empire, wages a war, not a battle or a fight, but a war against them, using a word that never describes a fight with an individual or individuals. And you saw how the beast kills them after they are already dead, and that they ascend into heaven, where they already are. All obvious literalistic contradictions, which force the reader into the symbolic frame of reference John gave to his use of the symbol, the two witnesses, in verse 4, where he openly states they are symbolic, before he begins the rest of the text. In video 27 we covered the actual fulfillment of the first 9 prophecies given in the chapter. The reed measuring stick John was given, prophesied in verse 1, was the same thing as the Biblioridian prophesied in chapter 10. It was the coming of the modern Bible which created a standard of religious measurement. The 7 voices was John Wycliffe and the Lollard movement, because they had 7 founders, and the term Lollard actually literally means to mumble with the voice. Thus John referred to them as the coming of the 7 voices. And his prophecy was dated astronomically by Saturn, the crown, positioned over Orion, the rainbow angel, and geologically with a great storm, known as the Grode Mandarin, which means the great drowning of men. The second prophecy, dated around 1390, was that Jerusalem would be under Gentile control and filled with people from many nations, which was fulfilled in the conquest of Jerusalem, in the Crusades, and the coming of the Ottoman Turk Empire, which left the city of Jerusalem with the historical reference of housing every people under heaven. The third prophecy, dated at 1516, concerning the coming of the two witnesses, was fulfilled in the coming of the Protestant Reformation, because they were called by only 2 names, and the original meaning of the Latin word protestare was actually to bear witness. Thus they were prophesied by John as 2 witnesses, in the same way he prophesied the Lollards as the 7 voices. They were said to be clothed in sackcloth, because when they were burned alive as heretics, they were clothed in sackcloth for the execution. The 2 witnesses were empowered by the publication of the Textus Receptus, which has been symbolically called the cannonball of the Reformation, which loaded the Reformation cannon that Martin Luther fired. The fourth prophecy, dated for 1520, was the two trees and two lights in the heaven, which occurred at the very time of publication of the Babylonian captivity of the Church, in which Martin Luther identified the Pope as the biblical Antichrist. His publication was accompanied by a dual meteor shower in the sky in Gemini. The fifth prophecy, dated for 1536, occurred when the Counter-reformation became a campaign of burning God's witnesses, beginning with John Huss and William Tyndale and going on to murder countless thousands, including the Coventry martyrs. The sixth prophecy, dated for 1584, was fulfilled in God's retribution against the empire, for burning the witnesses, bringing the plagues of ergotism and the Black Death, the mega-droughts which did not stop until the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, and red tides, turning water to the color of blood. The seventh prophecy, dated for 1632, was fulfilled when the papacy declared open war against the Reformation, and defeated it militarily, killing its chief monarchical patron in Europe, the King of Sweden, and formally founding the Counter-reformation. The eighth prophecy, dated for 1680, was fulfilled when the Vatican's Counter-reformation fomented a reaction against the reformers in the Middle East, sponsoring the condemnation of the Patriarch Cyril of Constantinople and all Lutherans and Calvinist Protestants in the Middle East, in the Synod of Jerusalem. That very year, the ninth prophecy, dated for 1694, was fulfilled when the witnesses were refused burial after the Synod of Jerusalem, and were left rotting in the streets throughout the empire. We will begin again, where we left off, at verse 10, which reads as follows in the Greek transliteration. Quote, "And the residents upon the land will greet themselves, even make merry, and gifts they will give to each other, because these two prophets tormented the residents upon the land." End quote. And now we come to prophecy number 10, dated for the year 1708, where the beast institutes greetings of merry and gift-giving, to celebrate the defeat of the witnesses, which is an obvious, and historically unique, reference to Christmas, as no other celebration, by any religion, carries these two signature customs, greetings of merry and gift-giving. So what happened around the year 1708 involving greetings of merry and gift-giving? The year 1708 was one of the most important years in Western civilization, in reference to the Counter-Reformation and its goal of the destruction of emerging biblical Christianity from the Reformation. Four major things occurred simultaneously in 1708 that would fulfill the prophecy in Revelation chapter 11, verse 10. And we will look at these four things that fulfilled the prophecy concerning 1708, and the institution of greetings of merry and gift-giving, practiced today in Christmas, now. As stated previously, in the year 1708, four major events took place in the history of religion that changed the course of civilization. These four events and developments were the seminal moments in prophetic history that fulfilled the prophecy given by John in Revelation chapter 11 verse 10, written over 1.5 millennia earlier. These four developments are as follows, not in order of their occurrence, but in order of their importance. The first was the completion of the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. This was the same cathedral destroyed in the fire of London in 1666, which you saw in video 27 on the burning of the two witnesses and God's retribution. Secondly, also during the same year, a very important literary work was completed, entitled Collier's Ecclesiastical History, and it was published also in 1708. The third development was the emergence of something called Tractarianism, which would eventually be called the Oxford Movement in English society and religion. This was reflected in the thesis of Collier's Ecclesiastical History, which we will discuss in a few minutes. And the fourth thing that happened in 1708 was the consolidation of the East India Trading Company, one of the most powerful and corrupt commercial corporations to ever exist in history. So what does all this have to do with Revelation 11 verse 10 and the greetings of Mary and gift-giving in fulfillment of John's prophecy? We will go through what each of these mean and how they fulfilled prophecy number 10 now. First, we will begin with the completion of the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Because of the emphasis placed on New Testament theology, the Reformation did not give itself to building Gothic cathedrals. As you saw in video 29 concerning Martin Luther's comments on the topic, the evangelical church in the New Testament practiced their faith in their homes as families. They had no cathedrals or mega-churches or church buildings of any kind. They practiced their faith in their homes. Nor was it part of their ecclesiology to have such buildings, because part of their gospel message to the world was that God did not dwell in temples made with hands. Since that is so, there is no reason to build any. Christ had said in Matthew chapter 24 verse 28, speaking of the passage of the temple in God's plan, that only vultures, translated into English as eagles, would gather around the carcass in the future. The Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell, used the old St. Paul's Cathedral as a barracks location for his troops during the English Civil War. Puritans, in keeping with Reformation theology, placed no value on these Gothic cathedrals. The Puritan government was defeated in 1660 and state compulsion of Christmas was restored, with the return of the English monarchy. Along with the return of the monarchy, also came a committed rejection of Reformation theology by the newly restored monarchical British government, who wanted nothing to do with it. 6 years later, however, the London fire occurred, and St. Paul's Cathedral was burned down, along with a very large chunk of downtown London, as you have seen previously. The design for the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral was the work of Sir Christopher Wren, who had been a professor at Oxford, and as such, was part of what became the Oxford movement, to overthrow the effects of the Reformation in England, which had been blamed for the rise of Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan Civil War, and the deposition of the English monarchy. After Cromwell's democratic republic had been overthrown, and the monarchy restored, Sir Christopher Wren was appointed a professorship at Oxford. The rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral was more than simply a building project. It marked the new direction of English religion, away from the scriptures, back toward Anglo-Catholicism. When it was completed, St. Paul's Cathedral was the tallest building in London for 2 centuries, from 1710 to 1967. And, as would be expected, St. Paul's Cathedral is full of Masonic symbolism in its architectural design. It was built to serve as an international symbol and center for the Church of England, which was now to become the government-sponsored missionary of a new Counter-reformation theology, known as Anglo-Catholicism, embodied in St. Paul's Cathedral itself. A theology, however, that had been built entirely on the historical fiction and Gnostic Roman theology of English Freemasonry. And that brings us to the second item in the list. In order to propagate this new theological fiction, academics needed an authoritative historical reference which put together the narrative that the Church of England developed parallel to the Church of Rome as a co-equal branch of Roman Catholicism, who were also given the keys of the ecclesiastical kingdom, and an original apostolic succession from Paul, just like the papacy from Peter, in Rome. And that was the purpose of Collier's ecclesiastical history. Part of this new Anglo-Catholic theology was that the Roman ecclesiastical calendar focused around Christmas, Easter and Lent, developed in England in parallel to the holy days in Rome, and was to be incorporated as well into the Anglican Church. Which of course it didn't. It was all pure historical fiction. But it was taught as real ecclesiastical history at Oxford University, and in the Oxford movement, for decades afterwards, nonetheless, anyway. Because the historical myth served a political purpose for the British monarchy, who could have cared less whether it was ever actually true or not. As a result of all these changes in England, the English Counter-reformationist movement became the dominant religious influence. They would come to be known as the Oxford movement, because they had historically emerged from resistance at the University of Oxford against William Tyndale and the Lollards, which you remember from the videos on Chapter 10, as depicted in the heavens, the rainbow angel fighting the ox. One of the primary goals of the Oxford movement was the re-establishment of the Roman Catholic Christ Mass on December 25th. Prior to the label, the Oxford movement, this movement was known by the term the Tractarians. And we will look at that in more detail, in just a moment. The third point of historical development, along with the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral and the publication of Collier's Ecclesiastical History, was the emergence of the Tractarian movement, which later came to be called the Oxford Movement. The Tractarian Oxford Movement is a long and complex story, and virtually any statement made about it in the past was going to be challenged in one form or another. However, today, much of the controversy about the Oxford Movement need no longer be controversial, because much of the controversy concerning this movement came from what many English Protestants claimed it was dishonestly and secretly doing. And while predictions about what this movement was really up to, concerning the future, could always be dismissed with mockery, hindsight is 20/20. And now, not so easily dismissed. The people who issued the warnings about this movement, from the past, were mocked and silenced as fringe lunatics. They were labeled with a variety of ugly social adjectives, and summarily dismissed. But what they warned was coming to England as a result of the work of the Oxford Movement has fully and completely materialized in our recent history. And all the denials, excuses and dismissals used to bury them under in the past, have since come to light in our day as false pretenses. But no one is bothering to go back in history and issue any apologies to those who were falsely slandered. Instead of being recognized as the sages and seers of history that they really were, they are now simply forgotten. And the only thing that is remembered about them now is what they were called, rather than what they accurately warned was coming. If you look up the definition of the Oxford Movement in the Encyclopedia Britannica, you will read the following. The Oxford Movement, quote, sought a renewal of Catholic or Roman Catholic thought and practice within the Church of England, in opposition to the Protestant tendencies of the Church. End quote. Or in other words, the Oxford Movement worked to drive the Church of England away from Protestantism, back to Catholicism. It was a Counter-reformation movement. The Encyclopedia Britannica goes on to say, quote, the argument was that the Anglican Church was by history and identity, a truly Catholic Church. End quote. Today, the goal of that movement has been fully realized, and the Church of England has completed its return to the Roman papacy, precisely as these earlier voices in history warned the English people was coming. The argument the Oxford Movement made, that the Church of England was a separate and equal branch of Catholicism historically, was of course nonsensical historical gobbledygook. Recognition of the authority of the papacy is what established the Catholic Church from its beginning, in the Edict of Thessalonica, precisely as Paul had prophesied in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. To the very same city that was the recipient of that very edict, which did in fact fulfill Paul's very prophecy of the coming of the man of sin, who would speak over everything that was worshipped or called God. And along with the acceptance of the papacy in Rome, came the title Catholic, in that very same edict. Quote, all the various nations which are subject to our clemency, profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans, and which is now professed by the Pontiff Damasus. End quote. The edict continues. Quote, we authorize followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians, but as for the others, we decree that they shall be branded with the name of heretics and shall not presume to give to their conveyancies the name of churches. End quote. The term, Catholic, whether it was stated in the uppercase C, or lowercase c, was publicly and openly legally contingent on acceptance of the absolute religious authority of the Vatican's papacy. It was not a biblical term, or even a Christian theological term. It was a legal term, coined by the Roman Empire, to describe its own specified religion. Defined in no uncertain, specific terms, in the Edict of Thessalonica, which did not include any reference to the New Testament, or any primary source documentation in reference to its authenticity, whatsoever. The only external reference it makes at all was to a bishop named Peter, in Alexandria, Egypt. It was an edict, as the title explains. It was based completely, strictly and solely, on the legal and political authority of the Roman Empire, by way of a sweeping unconditional legal decree. And absolutely nothing else. It was the arbitrary legal invention of the Roman Empire. Pointing to prior use of the term Catholic by Latin fathers, such as the Nicolaitan, Ignatius of Antioch, is historically meaningless, because none of these Latin fathers had ever used the term Catholic, historically, in this newly created, legal and ecclesiastical sense. and when the Nicolaitan, Ignatius of Antioch, invoked the name Catholic in his day, he was using it to distinguish himself and the religious communities he was associated with. In contrast to the Jewish disciples and their traditions, we actually read about in the New Testament. He openly rejected the commandment by Christ to observe the Passover, replacing it with an arbitrary invention of his own making, that he admits in his own writings. Many Christians simply refused to accept, because it was not the authentic practices of Christ's supper, and therefore was not his blood and flesh. The Edict of Thessalonica, which legally defined the new meaning of this term, had never existed before, in this manner, in history. Thus the purpose of the edict, to make it so. And any use of the term Catholic to mean anything otherwise, after the Edict of Thessalonica, was actually made an illegal act and a crime against the state. And this occurred in 380 AD, long before England was ever even visited by any Christians. The earliest presence of Christianity in the English Isles has been traced by historians to the year 563 AD, almost 2 entire centuries after the Edict of Thessalonica, in something known as the Hiberno-Scottish Mission, and an Irish Catholic missionary figure, known as Saint Columba. You will often see the claim made by Roman Catholic sources, that unlike everyone else's church, their church has no founding date. But that claim is historical mythology. The founding dates for Roman Catholicism are as well known to history as anyone else's modern churches. And their founding dates are not even the earliest dates, but centuries after Christ. And the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD was in fact one of those seminal founding dates. The edict documents the existence of Christians outside of the rule of Roman authority, outside the name Catholic, and what the Roman Empire fully intended to do about them. It is clear they pre-existed the Edict of Thessalonica, and they did not embrace the name Catholic, and thus they were never a part of the Catholic Church, in any fashion, before or after the edict. And what St. Columba was actually spreading to the British Isles was by no means New Testament Christianity. It was Gnostic Roman Catholicism that had already elected a pope by the name of 3/6, instituted the worship of Apollo as Christ, and decreed the extermination of Christ's entire earthly family, to consolidate its political power in Rome. And this religion was actually anything but Christian. It was Roman, not Christian. It simply falsely appropriated the term Christian by the edge of a sword. In fact, Pope Pius XII made this fact perfectly clear in his own declaration, when he stated, quote, "To be Christian one must be Roman. One must recognize the ones of Christ's Church that is governed by one successor of the Prince of the Apostles, who is the Bishop of Rome, Christ's vicar on earth." End quote. And of course, not a word of that is anywhere to be found in the New Testament, in the writings of the apostles themselves. In fact, the case is quite the opposite in the New Testament. Peter, far from being Prince of the Apostles, is actually lucky he did not damn himself with his own arrogance. Where in Matthew chapter 16 verse 23 and Mark chapter 8 verse 22, Christ rebukes him and calls him Satan. Then Peter is recorded as denying Christ during his crucifixion with cursing and swearing in God's name. In Mark chapter 14 verses 70 and 71. And if this were not all already bad enough, later the junior convert, the Apostle Paul, has to rebuke him publicly to his face, in front of everyone else, again, for making the gospel of grace completely void. Recorded in Galatians chapter 2 verses 11 through 14. So he was hardly anybody's Prince of the Apostles, at least according to the apostles themselves. And the requirement to be Roman, in order to be Christian, is obviously completely contrary to what Paul repeated over and over to his disciples. And if anything, they were to consider themselves the real spiritual Jews, as Paul stated openly in the epistle to the Romans in chapter 2 verses 28 and 29. He did not tell them to be Romans, but instead, to realize they were inwardly Jews, which was the exact opposite of a Roman. Rome never got a monopoly on the word Christian, and no apostle ever associated the word Christian with anything Roman, whether it was past, present, or even in the prophetic future, in the New Testament. The political and religious powers of Rome and its empire, past, present, or future, were always presented by biblical authors as completely and forever outside the covenant of Christ. There is no such thing as a Roman Catholic Church in the New Testament, except in a very negative sense in Matthew chapter 7 verse 22, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the entire book of Revelation, which we are studying now, and as you can clearly see. Apart from that invented legal definition, stated in the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, there was no Roman Catholic Church, past, present or future. And certainly, not in the far reaches of England, apart from the Roman papacy. It was pure historical fantasy to believe otherwise. And any refusal to accept that title, and embrace the demands of submission to the papacy, signified by use of that title, Catholic, resulted in confiscation of private property and wealth by the state, and banishment or execution of any people therein, including in the Roman-ruled territory of England. So there never had been a Catholic Church of England, Catholic Church, apart from the Roman Pontifex Maximus, or Roman papacy. Because that is what the term itself meant, from the very beginning, when it had been legally coined, by the Roman Empire, in the Edict of Thessalonica. And this all did not occur, in the Council of Trent, but in the Edict of Thessalonica, over 1,000 years earlier. Which Counter-reformationists like to pretend never happened. Instead, Counter-Reformation Protestants like to pretend everything was about the Council of Trent only. And nothing could be further from the truth. It was about the entire history of the Roman Empire and its dealings with the apostolic faith as recorded in the New Testament, from the 1st century onward, when the New Testament had been written. Every deviation, every corruption, every innovation, and every deception. That is what the consensus of the Reformation was attempting to address and clarify. And that was the whole point of Reformed theology. That is what the debates and discussion were all about, and still continue to be about today. Not the Council of Trent, which was, in effect concerning theology, completely irrelevant. It simply stated what everyone already knew. The Catholic Church had no interest in anything other than its own legal position of power in the Roman Empire. And anything that got in its way, needed to be wholesale exterminated. Even if it meant exterminating the entire blood kin, earthly family of Christ, and every single one of his family's descendants and relatives. There was no Roman Catholic Church before the Edict of Thessalonica, apart from the papacy, lowercase c or uppercase c, and there was no Catholic Church apart from the papacy afterwards. The Catholic Church in any sense of the word Catholic, has since day one, been about the papacy in Rome. And virtually nothing else, but that. So when the Oxford movement propagated this fraud against the English people, that the Church of England was a co-equal branch of the Catholic Church, even the propagators of that fraud knew perfectly well it was simply historical fiction. It was an admitted fairy tale for the English, crafted for the sole intent to deceive and seduce them into Roman Catholicism. Since the Church of England has returned to the papacy, the pretense of that fraud is no longer needed. And now the Church of England openly admits the claim to have been false all along. Now that it is no longer needed as social engineering. And this is how the Counter-Reformation behaves in every matter concerning its dealings with history. It openly and intentionally invents fabrications, uses them to get what it wants, then abandons them with the same ease of conscience they invented it, as soon as it is no longer needed. That is why you can never trust any Counter-Reformation source on virtually anything from theology to history. They say whatever is convenient in the moment, and nothing else will ever come out of their mouth. Because their epistemology is nothing more than one of political utilitarianism, which defeats the whole point of being a Christian to begin with. Christ said those who worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth, and that requirement by Christ places the Church of England and its utilitarian epistemology completely outside the true worship of God. The Oxford movement may have been successful in converting the nation of England back to the papacy, but it did so at the expense of no longer being a Christian country. The Church of England today. And that is why St. Paul's Cathedral is a temple for English Masonic esoterica, not Christianity. And what it is giving its people are the Gnostic doctrines of Rome's Desert Fathers, not the teachings of Christ and his apostles, found in the New Testament. The effect of the Oxford movement, which was actually the English Counter-Reformation, was expansive. It generated such institutions as the Masonic Lodges, the Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, and the Oxford Press, which published the C.I. Scofield Bible, a study Bible commentary written entirely by a convicted felon con artist, an academic fraud, which the Oxford publishers in all probability fully knew at the time. And it was the promotion and sale of this Bible that led to the acceptance of Counter-reformation rapture eschatology in America. Most people who hear about the very famous Rhodes Scholarships, which are known all over the world today, rarely realize its completely hideous, counter-reformationist history, associated with Cecil Rhodes, Oxford University, and the Oxford Movement. While many recipients of the Rhodes Scholarships often display the award on their resumes with great pride, virtually no one would, if the public really knew the hideous history of how and why it was started by the English counter-reformationist and white supremacist Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Scholarship would in reality become a mark of complete shame and humiliation, not pride, as there is in reality nothing to be proud about receiving an honor from such an institution for the purposes of what its counter-reformationist founders founded it to do. And that would be especially true of any American who was in fact a real Christian. So you see, the Counter-Reformation has been busy in other places too. Not only were they busy feeding American evangelicalism the virus hoax theology of rapture futurism eschatology, they were also busy abusing the English Protestants with a theological hoax known as branch theory theology, which served as the foundation for the Anglican Church since the completion of St. Paul's Cathedral. Both of which were completely fictitious and utterly ridiculous theologies that served no purpose other than to undermine the actual truths discovered in the Reformation. Perhaps in the twisted minds of counter-reformationists, they figured if you were stupid enough to actually believe these hoaxes, then you fully deserved the spiritual destruction and punishment they were going to bring. And the majority of Protestants both in the United Kingdom and in America came to these theologies like sheep to the slaughter. All that was required to lead them in masses to their own theological destruction was simply greedy preachers and dishonest priests, of which there was an abundance on both fronts. And that brings us now to the fourth event of 1708, the consolidation of the East India Trading Company, which we will look at next. What is colloquially referred to as the East India Trading Company was actually officially named the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies. Its official charter was created in 1708 from a previous version which actually consisted of two different trading companies. The new merged version in 1708, however, was much more directly connected to the British government. The East India Trading Company became the commercial basis of the British Empire. It was also one of the most corrupt commercial organizations in history. It spread the slave trade across the world and pioneered the international narcotics business. It was the organization responsible for not only the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of men, women and children, it also became the sponsor of numerous opium dens throughout London and parts of the world the British Empire ruled. The same opium dens that made thousands of addicts and killed thousands more from its trade and death. This was the same East India Trading Company that sparked the Revolutionary War in colonial America, through its unfair and repressive tax policies levied against the colonies. These taxes were actually collected for the benefit of the East India Trading Company, not the British government. While the history of its slaving business is fairly well known, until they were driven out of the slave trading business by the evangelicals and Quakers in England, its role in the international drug cartel business is not as well known. It was also responsible later for what is known as the Opium Wars of the 1800s. And as the name suggests, was actually a series of wars intended to protect its narcotics cartel, and for what many believe was eventually turning Queen Victoria herself into a full-blown drug addict. But aside from the many demonic activities of the East India Trading Company, which ironically prefixed the title honorable to its commercial name, the not-so-honorable East India Trading Company was also the commercial vehicle that financed and spread the Masons throughout the British Empire, holding a government-granted monopoly on all merchant trade throughout the empire. If anyone wanted to engage in trade in any realm under British rule, they had to do so through the not-so-honorable East India Trading Company, which also meant they had to embrace English Freemasonry. Most people who have researched Freemasonry are aware of the fact that it is often said that Freemasonry came from the merchants' guilds of the Middle Ages. What is usually not listed in these articles, however, is that Freemasonry, as an organization, in its present form, came directly from the British Empire. And it came from the British Empire in the form of the Merchants' Guild of the not-so-honorable East India Company. This is the actual Merchants' Guild that Masonry actually emerged from. Not only was the not-so-honorable East India Company run entirely by English Freemasons, it was through this commercial vehicle that lodges were funded all over the world, throughout the British Empire. And throughout this network, that spanned the globe, the English Counter-Reformation was busy both persecuting and illuminating any rise of genuine biblical Reformation Christianity in its midst. The East India Trading Company, and its covert spread of Freemasonry across the world, was very successful in economically and politically undermining, and ultimately destroying, local biblical Christianity from within its midst. And now we are going to see how these four things came together in 1708, to fulfill the prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 verse 10, which we will look at now. As you saw earlier in video 28, after the work of the Counter-Reformation in the Middle East with the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Synod of Jerusalem, the Vatican's policy of burial refusal was extended to the city of Jerusalem. In 1841, English Parliament passed the Bishops in Foreign Countries Act of 1841. It established a joint ecclesiastical effort with the Evangelical Church of Russia to create a Protestant cemetery in Jerusalem for the purpose of finally permitting the burial of deceased Protestants. This joint effort to provide a burial ground for deceased Protestants so enraged the leader of the Oxford movement back in the UK, that this leader resigned his affiliation with the Anglican Church and publicly converted to Roman Catholicism. The name of this leader was John Henry Newman. He would later come to be known as simply Cardinal Newman, and in 2010, Pope Benedict had Cardinal Newman canonized as a saint for his sabotage and betrayal of the Anglican Church in England, and his stand against the burial of Protestants in Jerusalem. In 1842, shortly after Newman's public defection to the Church of Rome, a Wesleyan minister by the name of Henry Fish published a book entitled Jesuitism Traced in the Movements of the Oxford Tractarians. In this book, the Reverend Henry Fish traces the emergence of the Jesuits in England and Ireland to this very same period of history. Cardinal Michelangelo Tamburini was elected as General of the Jesuit Order in 1706 and ruled until 1730. Reverend Fish traced the introduction of the Jesuits in England, in the Tractarian Oxford movement, to public comments made by Cardinal Tamburini concerning the intentions of the Jesuits, in the very year of 1708. Reverend Fish accused the Jesuits of conducting an intentional campaign to essentially subvert the English public, through a deceptively covert propaganda campaign within the Oxford movement, into converting the Anglican Church back to Roman Catholicism. The Masonic order within English society, naturally, was quick to mock the claim and dismiss this author as paranoid. However, approximately 50 years later, another book was published entitled The Secret History of the Oxford Movement, in which the author, Walter Wash, actually obtained written documents, held in possession of the Oxford movement, that demonstrated Fish's claims had been completely correct. Since they couldn't accuse this author of paranoia, they attacked on the grounds he had no right to the secret materials that he had made public, and once again, they simply encouraged the public to ignore what had been published. But the second book by Walter Wash documented the fact that the book by Henry Fish nearly 50 years earlier had actually been a true and accurate account. Not paranoid at all, but factually grounded in actual, real, written documentation to prove it. And Henry Fish traced the emergence of the Jesuits in England to the very year 1708. Precisely as is the time frame is given for our prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 verse 10. But that is not all. As you have seen previously, the Counter-Reformation has been telling a truckload of lies to hide the origin, history and true religious meaning of Christmas from the public. lies that know no bounds, and are told without even the slightest hint of a conscience. They have not only had to lie about the historical origins of Christmas in history, as the continued worship of the devil under the name of Christ, they have had to lie about the history of the Reformation's condemnation of it, as a product of, and in servitude to, the biblically prophesied Antichrist. But the Counter-reformation has also gone out of its way to intentionally concoct hoax theologies designed for the sole purpose of simply deceiving people into acceptance of things Christians in history past knew clearly to be both morally wrong and spiritually dangerous. Obviously, if Christmas were all that Counter-reformationists claim that it really is, all that lying and propagandizing would not be necessary. But it clearly is necessary. When you go to research the real history and origin of Christmas and the modern customs we now associate with it, there is a lot of misinformation that is intentionally spread among the public to keep its roots hidden in the Gnostic Antichrist movement of the Middle Ages. But if you peel these layers of surface disinformation away, you will discover some very interesting details about the historical development of Christmas, and especially the customs of greetings of Mary and gift-giving, and how they fulfill the prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 verse 10. Numerous historical researchers have actually traced the development of our modern Christmas to the Oxford movement in the British Empire. In the article which you see on your screen, the author states that Christmas was restored as a legal holiday in England in 1660, when the Puritan Democratic Republic was overthrown by the monarchy. That was the same year that the fire of Constantinople destroyed the capital city of the Eastern Empire. 6 years later, the fire of London destroyed the city of London in the west, and St. Paul's Cathedral. The author explains that despite Christmas having been restored legally, the majority of the common population, who were mostly Protestant at the time, still resented the holiday. The Oxford movement made it one of their primary goals to restore the observance of Christmas among the common people. And one of the things they instituted in order to achieve this was the giving of gifts, as you see right there in this article. But if this were not all amazing enough on its own, if you research the first recorded historically documented use of the intentional greeting of Mary, as in Merry Christmas, you will discover it was recorded in a letter by a British merchant marine captain sailing for the East India Company. And the date of this letter, which documents the earliest recorded use of the greeting, occurs in the year 1710, which is literally only 2 years after the target date of the prophecy of 1708, and all the Counter-Reformation events which occurred in that very year. So we see that the prophecy was not only fulfilled, but in the very time frame in history that it had predicted, and even by the very people who fulfilled it in history. The prophecy of Revelation chapter 11 verse 10 has in fact come to pass. And Christmas is the very custom it is pointing its finger at, prophetically, as a custom instituted by the beast. These customs are part of what the book of Revelation is calling the worship of the image of the beast, which is actually the worship of a hybrid Romanized Apollo Christ, born on December 25th, not the Christ of the New Testament, who was born nowhere near that time, and never commanded any such religious observances, nor ever taught them to any of his disciples. The historical fulfillment of chapter 11 verse 10 in the year of 1708 takes us through the fulfillment of 10 prophecies in our list of 13 prophecies in the second woe, and the sixth trumpet. There are only 3 remaining prophecies on our list. Prophecy number 11 from verse 11 that the witnesses are awakened and stand up. Prophecy number 12 is that a sound is heard from heaven and the witnesses ascend. And prophecy number 13 completes the sixth trumpet judgment with an earthquake in Jerusalem. And we will look at those 3 prophecies now. In verse 11, John prophesies that after 3.5 days, which as you recall, was a time conversion value to date the text, the Spirit of God enters into the witnesses wake up and are revived, and that they stand up on their feet again. It also says that this event causes their enemies great fear. The prophecy in verse 11 is very significant. As you recall, the 2 witnesses were a prophetic reference to the Protestant Reformation. You have just seen how it was destroyed in Europe. and now they are celebrating the demise of the two witnesses with greetings of Mary and gift-giving. It looks like smooth sailing for the forces of the beast, also known as the Counter-reformation. Protestantism has been killed. It's been denied burial. It's rotting in the streets throughout the empire. All is well, if you are the beast. And suddenly, verse 11 comes. Instead of the witnesses simply disappearing, the Spirit of God comes into them, they are awakened and revived, and they stand up on their feet. The witnesses are awakened and revived. And this awakening and revival of the witnesses causes great fear. And we have a date approximation for these next two texts. 1750 is the first approximation date, and is an approximation only, as the date is not from the text itself. We have two approximation dates, involving prophecy number 11 at 1750 and prophecy number 12 at 1792. The dates of 1754 verse 11, and 1792 for verse 12, are simply the distance of time between the textually arrived dates of 1834 and 1708, divided by 3 to give us two approximate dates in between. They are purely our approximation between 1708 and 1834, so that we know generally where to look on the historical timeline to find these events. And we do also have a specific astronomical event given to us from the text to confirm the occurrence of this prophecy on Earth. As you recall earlier, in Hebrew, the planet Jupiter was called Sadek, which means righteousness, and it was associated with the divine indwelling, or what Christians refer to as the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of holiness or righteousness. Earlier, in verse 3, when the text talked about empowering the two witnesses, we saw that was a reference to Jupiter, Sadek, or the Spirit of righteousness, moving into Gemini, the two witnesses. And we have similar language here in this text, in verse 11, when God awakens and revives the two witnesses from death, with the imagery that they stand upon their feet, and great fear falls upon their enemies. This astronomical dating will help us identify these events on the historical timeline. Whenever this occurs, we should see Gemini rising from a horizontal position in the eastern sky to the upright vertical position on their 2 feet, standing on the western horizon. And we should see Jupiter, or Sadek, the Spirit of righteousness, having moved into Gemini as well. And remember, we are talking about the synchronization of 2 sky clocks at the same time. It takes Jupiter 12 years to return to a constellation. So we have one 12-year Jupiter clock cycle, which has to overlap and synchronize exactly with another completely separate 1-year clock cycle of the constellations, making the synchronization of both of these at the same time very rare occasions in the range of centuries. What we do know from the text is that between 1708, when the greetings of Mary and gift-giving are instituted by the beast, and the earthquake in Jerusalem in 1834, there is the awakening and revival of the witnesses. And then the earthquake comes. The approximation for the time frame for this event is sometime in history around the year 1750. So what was it? And what is this text actually telling us? If we look into history around the time of 1750, we will discover another amazing fulfillment of this text. One that is so specific and detailed, and accompanied by astronomical dating, that it makes it virtually impossible to claim this is all accidental. If you Google the question, "What was happening in religion 1750?" this is the page that your Google query will return. The first listing on the page, past the also related question boxes, is a timeline of religious history, created by PBS television. If you click on that link, it will take you to this timeline, and you will see the year 1750 displayed on the bar. Right next to the year 1750, you will see a box with someone's face in it, and the caption, "First Great Awakening Undermines Authority of Established Churches." The man in the picture is an American colonial minister by the name of Jonathan Edwards, who started something called the Great Awakening. There were actually 2 of them. The First Great Awakening from 1740 and the Second Great Awakening in 1790. Church historians have kept adding to them, wanting to be associated with them, with a third and even a fourth Great Awakening, but neither of which were actually awakenings. There were really only 2. But the First and Second Great Awakenings, sometimes referred to as simply the Great Awakening, was a revival movement. Now, all these terms such as awakening and revival, despite the fact they fit into the Revelation prophecy exactly, were actually what they were literally called. Historians refer to this period of history as the Great Awakening. And they explain that this Great Awakening was a movement of revivals. These are the same terms used by secular historians to describe this period of history. To understand the incredible significance of these terms, and how they fulfilled Revelation chapter 11, all you have to do is look up the etymology of the terms, awakening, and revival. The term awakening comes from the word, waken. If you look up the etymology of the term, waken, you will discover it literally means, to rise up, as in, risen. And if you look up the second term, revival, it means something even more amazingly specific to Revelation 11. The term revival, from the word, revive, from the Latin word, revivere, literally means, to live again. You heard that right, the term literally means, to live again. Precisely as we see in the text in Revelation 11 verse 11. So you see in the very terminology, once again, just like with the term lallards, meaning to mumble with the voice, and the seven voices, and the term protestari, which meant to bear witness, described as the two witnesses, the Great Awakening, and revival, meant literally to come back from the dead, to rise, to stand up again, precisely as the text is describing, in Revelation 11 verse 11. Where the two witnesses, which was a prophetic reference to the Protestant Reformation, will rise again and come back from the dead. And that is precisely what happened during this period of history to the year. There is no question this prophecy refers to the Great Awakening. Not only evidenced by the terminology itself, and not only as evidenced by the time frame, and by the prophetic description given in the text, but as you will soon see, it is confirmed by astronomical dating, which marks the event as an unmistakable fulfillment of this prophecy in history. And the Great Awakening stood in complete contrast to what was happening in England with the Tractarian Oxford, Counter-reformation movement, and their return to Roman Catholicism. The First and Second Great Awakening were literally an opposite to the Oxford movement. And it created the exact opposite of Oxford University, in American history and academics. The Great Awakening resulted in the establishment of Ivy League schools such as Princeton University, Dartmouth University, and influenced the intellectual direction of Yale University, as well. If you click on the site's links to Jonathan Edwards from the box, this is the article it will take you to. And as you can see, it is an article about Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakening. In the very first sentence, the article mentions another preacher named George Whitefield, and then goes on to cite a single sermon, preached by Jonathan Edwards, entitled, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. The sermon, entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was the single most significant event in the beginning of the Great Awakening. When you begin to research the Great Awakening, the sermon comes up over and over again as a catalyst moment for the Great Awakening. It's hard to imagine a single sermon having such an impact as to change the course of history, but that is precisely what history points to as the single most significant initiating event of the Great Awakening. If you research the history surrounding when this sermon was first given, you will again find some incredible facts related to the prophecy in Revelation chapter 11 verse 11, and this event in history. It turns out that the sermon was once again first given in a house fellowship at Enfield, Connecticut, on July 8, 1741. Just 9 years earlier from our approximation. It turns out our approximation date of 1750 was right during the Great Awakening that had been sparked by this sermon given on July 8, 1741. The article on your screen shows a commemorative stone in Enfield, Connecticut, that marks the place where this sermon was given. But that's not all. If you look at what was over the sky of Enfield, Connecticut that day, this is what you would have been looking at. Both Jupiter and the Sun have moved into Gemini. And Gemini is rising on the eastern horizon at sunrise, in the horizontal position, as though the two witnesses were laying on the ground, as though they were dead. But, as it rises through the sky that day, Gemini moves to the vertical position as though they are standing up. And then, Gemini sets on the western horizon with the sunset, standing upright, on the ground. And this all occurs on precisely July 8, 1741, at the very exact time in history the First and Second Great Awakenings are beginning. What are the odds of that? There is obviously no way this all could have been a random accident. And what was so remarkable about Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? It was subtitled, The Dangers of an Unconverted Clergy. And what it produced in its hearers was described as people being so moved by great fear that they literally physically shaked and cried and moaned. It was great fear. Some of the greatest fear ever recorded in the history of evangelism sermons. It produced great fear on the hearers who had been seduced by the Counter-reformation out of Europe. It literally put the fear of God into the public. But that was not the only fear it produced. As the Great Awakening took effect in America, it laid the groundwork historically for what would come years later as the American Revolution. The two witnesses were standing up again. In England, and its Counter-Reformation Catholicized state church was in great fear of what they saw coming. So we discover that the 7 voices in chapter 10 were the Lollards because they had 7 founders and the word Lollard meant to mumble with the voice. We discover the 2 witnesses were the Protestant Reformation because they were called by 2 names only, and the term Protestant originally meant to bear witness. And now we see that the revival of the 2 witnesses was literally the awakening and revival of Protestantism, which had died out because of the Counter-Reformation, Oxford movement. And all these historic events were accompanied with both signs in the heavens, and verifiable documented events on the earth. But this information also points to the very unwanted truth, that the Counter-Reformation is indeed working for the Antichrist, and that Christmas is in fact the worship of the image of the beast, in Revelation, which you will continue to see more and more proof of, as we continue to go through the book. You have seen in this video, that in the year 1708, the Counter-Reformation began a major missionary program to destroy Reformation Protestantism in Europe, and this was coordinated with the institutionalization of greetings of Mary and gift-giving to reinstitute Christmas in England, among the public in the British Empire, after the defeat of the Puritan Democratic Republic, and its ban on government sponsorship of Christmas. You have seen how the Jesuits infiltrated the English-speaking world through the Tractarian Oxford movement, and how in contrast to the Oxford Counter-Reformation movement, the Great Awakening took place in America, leading to the establishment of Ivy League universities. And you have seen how these events fulfill Revelation 11 verse 11 in the terms used to describe these events, the matching time frame, the description provided in the text itself, and the astronomical event described in the text, which marked the event as its fulfillment. In the next video, we will continue with the next verse in Revelation chapter 11 verse 12, and once again show how these amazing prophecies have been fulfilled in history, along with what it means for us today. Find out what John was talking about when he described the 2 witnesses ascending to heaven, and how the great earthquake of Jerusalem actually occurred in history, and these prophecies were fulfilled right before our very eyes. Don't miss the exciting revelation of the conclusion of the 6th trumpet in history. Thank you for watching.